here.
It's great to be having you. Let's give it a few more seconds because I see the room getting fuller. Perfect. So we will dive right in. Everyone, today's conversation with Elena is going to be a dense topic. We want to cover a range of issues from social media, underlying business model, polarization, how we can affect change. So it's going to be dense and entertaining, and bear with us as we're going to try to unpack all of these threads. Before diving in and before introducing Elena more fully, I wanted to give a quick overview at the next 30 minutes. Elena and I will be having a conversation roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and then we open up for Q&A. You should be seeing a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in there, and we'll field them towards the end of our time. All right. With that being said, let's start. Elena, you are an Ashoka Fellow. You're the co-founder of BuildUp. You have over a decade of experience of working in conflict situations with multilateral organizations, with civil society actors. You've advised the UN. And I also mention it here because it will matter later in our conversation. You are an economist by training with a degree from Princeton, and you're an expert in digital tech. Now, when you go onto BuildUp's website, you describe your work as saying you are all about conflict transformation in the digital age. And I was wondering whether you could give us a brief glimpse of context, what we need to know about that topic of your work, this arc of your work.
I think the main thing to know about that arc of our work is that it has two sides. And one side is about the great potential in the use of digital technologies to promote peace. So we work quite extensively with networks of peace innovators, civil society actors that are working on peace building processes and that are using technology to make sure that more people are included in that work and that more voices are heard. So that's great. There's great potential there. And I think the other side of it is that we also work on what we term digital conflict, which is essentially understanding how digital technologies are impacting conflict escalation, how the use of things like social media, but also other digital capabilities are increasing conflict in our world, and what can be done to mitigate that or to transform it.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're working in countries as, geographically far apart as, let's say, the US and Germany and Yemen and Kenya. Can you give us an example of how that boils down to the practical experience of you and your team?
Yeah, because it can sound quite abstract, right, when you put it that way. But right. I think, to give just like a couple of examples, if you think about this side, which I talked about as the promise of technology, we did some work with the Office of the Special Envoy to the Secretary General of the United Nations in Yemen, where there was an interest in seeing how the views of women could be better incorporated into the peace process that they were running. But it was very difficult to convene women for a number of security and logistical reasons. And so we ran a series of focus group discussions and consultations using WhatsApp. So a very simple technology, but it managed to ensure the inclusion of a group that might have otherwise not been heard. So that's one example of sort of the potential. But then if you want to look at the other side, the sort of digital conflict aspect of it, recently, we've been doing some work with a number of partners, including with UNESCO, but also with Search for Common Ground and other areas in Kenya, looking at how misinformation about political processes, and particularly about the recent election, impacts the way that Kenyans understand their position within Kenya and their identity, and how that impacts conflict and what needs to be done about it. So kind of these two very different aspects of technology, if you see what I mean.
And in the latter example, it's like, draw out for us in how far, let's say, social media makes your work harder, which will also get us closer to the core theme of our chat today.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Kenya, my colleague Caleb, who was leading that work, said to me at one point, and he's somebody who does a lot of this work on social media, and he said to me, when I walk the streets, I feel like this is going to be a peaceful election, but when I read social media, I think I'm in a war zone. And I think that actually reflects a lot of what we see in other places. To give you another example, we did some work with a civil society partner in Kurdistan and in looking at the way that conversations were happening on social media in Kurdistan, we realized that what people said and how they positioned themselves had a lot to do with sectarian identity. So people were very quick to say whether they were Arab or Kurdish, and that would determine how they spoke about a whole host of different issues. And it meant that the conversations on Facebook, which is the platform we were looking at, were very, very polarized. So when you speak to peace building actors, the response you often get is it really feels like the odds are stacked against us on social media. It feels like it's an onslaught. There's not much that we can do in this space. Offline, there may be more space, but in these spaces, it really feels like there's no way that we can start a peaceful conversation.
And in that case, when you say sectarian identities, you mean ethnic identities? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean Kurdish versus Arab. That was the distinction in that particular situation. But these kind of, this idea about opposing groups or out groups opposing each other is something that we encounter a lot on social media, that we see come up over and over again. That's the driving factor in the way that people are interacting on social media.
One more question on that. So what is, in your point of view, the difference between an opinion that is just different from, let's say, my opinion, so which is normal in the democratic process, and what is an opinion that is polarizing?
Right. So I think the way I think about that is it's two different kinds of polarization, right? There's issue-based polarization, which is basically a difference of opinion. And as you say, that's really important. That's constructive conflict. We must disagree in a democratic process. And that's also part of being in a peace process. But when you talk about identities or groups opposing each other, that's what we call affective polarization. And what that means is that no matter what you actually say, I'm going to disagree with you because of the group that you belong to. But also, and equally importantly, no matter what you say, I'm likely to agree with you because of the group that you belong to. When a conversation or when a discussion or when a debate is at that state, is in a state in which people agree or disagree, not based on the content of what is happening, but based on who is speaking and what group they belong to, then you're in a situation where conflict is very likely to be destructive. And it can escalate to violence.
Yeah, and does that come with a different speech pattern? Like I remember in one of our discussions, you were saying, for instance, you can say anyone who's had an abortion is immoral.
Yeah.
Or I have moral queries about, qualms about abortion. And so one is, can you use an example like that to illustrate that?
That's exactly right. I think it's the difference in between saying, in the example about abortion that you were saying, saying anyone who has had an abortion is immoral, is essentially positioning two groups, those who have and those who haven't. Those are here and those who are there, right? There's no room for conversation, for nuance, for complexity, and therefore for finding any kind of common ground. If somebody says, I have moral qualms about abortion, they're not saying anything. They could have moral qualms about abortion and have had an abortion. They could have moral qualms about abortion and have family members who have had an abortion. They're not positioning themselves as people. They're positioning themselves about an issue. And that allows a lot more room for conversation. This is critical in any kind of conflict of opinion. But also very importantly, when that conflict it has a violent expression, right? When there is armed conflict of some kind.
So the usual way of social media companies to go towards effective polarization or to intervene when there is effective polarization, especially when it goes into sort of threats of violence and hate speech, is content moderation. You say that doesn't really help much. Can you explain why?
I think it helps in very specific situations. It helps with hate speech, which in many ways is the tip of this iceberg, right? But let me give another example. Very often, affective polarization is expressed through fear. Fear speech is not the same as hate speech. It can't be so easily identified. It probably won't violate the terms of service of platforms, but it can be equally polarizing. And we know that fear speech is used to essentially galvanize people and to incite violence, but it wouldn't fall foul of the content moderation guidelines of platforms. And we have seen that over and over again in examples in the real world. So that's why content moderation isn't going to work, because it will only catch a very small portion of objectively policy violating content, which is not the majority of the polarizing content that we're seeing online.
Now, let's go to the fact that there's also something built into the underlying architecture of social media platforms, which leads to almost the automatic, let's say, amplification of views that are extreme. And that has to do with how the algorithms of these platforms are coded. Explain to us how that works.
So I think there's actually two reasons why polarization thrives on social media. One is that it allows anyone pretty much to manipulate people and to deploy harassment en masse, right? But let's put that aside for a moment, because we all know about that. We know about troll armies, we know about all these things, Cambridge Analytica, like we've all heard about it, right? But the other aspect, which I think is a lot more, like deserves a lot more attention, is that the way that social media algorithms are built is that they're looking to serve you up with content that is engaging, right? And they will serve you up more content the more engaging it is. And we also know that polarizing content that is very emotive and that positions groups against each other is very engaging. So what that means is that social media platforms provide incentives to produce content that is polarizing because it will be more engaging. It's kind of like this thing that, that it's like a vicious circle, right? So you have content that is more engaging, which incentivizes people to produce more content like that, which makes it even more engaging, and so on. And so that means that polarizing content is basically king on social media platforms.
And it's sort of, to just rephrase what you just said, is basically saying sort of build into the business model, because the more, or that's an additional aspect, that because the more, so let's say content that is engaging get pushed into users' feeds, it gets more likes, more reposts, it will get shared more. So it has, it reaches a broader audience and lets people spend more time on platform. And that is also linked to, more profits basically for social media platforms who are running off it.
Well, that's the way that social media platforms are designed at the moment. They're designed to maximize engagement metrics, right? To basically say what we want to do is engage people with content, any kind of content. We don't care what that content is, except unless it's hate speech, right? In which case we will censor it. But in general, what we want is more engagement on anything. And that is built into their business model. It's because it allows them to sell more ads. It allows them to collect more data. They want people to spend more time on the platform. So engagement is the key metric. It's not the only metric, but it's the key metric that algorithms are optimizing for.
And now you could say, well, that's one thing that happens in the online world, but it does not have no consequences in the offline world. Whereas you are saying, and I'm taking something that I've known through our, work together, you're saying it does have consequences, and it's like a societal pollution that is happening as a side effect of the polarization that happens online. Can you draw out that connect for us?
I mean, I think the main thing to understand is that it's changing the way that we understand ourselves and other groups, and that it's creating divisions in society and critically amplifying existing divisions. And I think that that's the difference in between focusing on hate speech and harassment and focusing on this idea of polarization. Hate speech and harassment is about what the individual experience of being on social media, which is very important. But when we think about polarization, we're talking about the impact it's having on society as a whole. Regardless of whether I'm being personally harassed, I am still being impacted by the fact that I'm living in a more polarized society. It is a societal negative externality. It is something that is affecting all of us, regardless of whether we are individually affected by something.
And let me draw this out. That's important what you just said. When you're starting to describe the side effects, the societal pollution, let's say, of social media companies as negative externality. So now that is a concept that comes from economics, basically, and it describes the costs that occur that are not being captured inside the market that affect somebody else. Like we could use the example of, let's say, a company that produces cars and whatever pollutes the environment. There's CO2, so they are, so it makes the air bad to breathe. It's like a side effect of the production process, the cost of which are being borne by society, by somebody else. And go ahead.
Yeah, and I think the way to think about that is, and that the key here is that cost is not included in the production costs, and so it's not in any way priced by the market, right? Because we'll get onto what's happening with pollution now and carbon taxes, but essentially because traditionally in industrial capitalism, people were producing things and they were also producing pollution, but nobody had to pay for the pollution. It's as if that cost didn't exist. But it was actually a negative cost to society. It just wasn't being priced by the market. And that's the key, right? And something very similar is happening with social media platforms right now. Social media platforms aren't going out there. Their profit model isn't to create polarization. But what happens is that it's very expensive to clean up polarization, because they have an incentive to just create content that is more engaging, whatever it is, regardless of whether it's polarizing. There's no incentive to clean up the polarization, just like there's no incentive to clean up pollution. And that's why polarization is a negative externality of this surveillance capitalism business model.
And what are you proposing we do about that?
Make them pay for it. Bring it into the market mechanism. So if you think about how we thought about this with pollution, we now have the concept of a carbon footprint, right? A carbon footprint which measures essentially the negative impact of industrial production on society. And what we say is that should be taxed. There should be carbon taxes or some other mechanism, cap and trade. There's other mechanisms that can be used to bring that carbon footprint into the market mechanism. So could we do something similar with polarization? Could we say that social media platforms or any platform that is driven by an algorithm should be taxed for their polarization footprint?
I think that's a very novel idea. And we also want to mention that there are other ideas obviously circulating and being discussed. Like, for those in the US, there's the whole discussion around Section 2030 and the liability of social media platforms, and that is sort of being stuck. And I think what's really interesting about your model is to look at it, with the analogy of carbon, and look at it and say, okay, there is a pollution that is occurring. We need to punish it. One way we could explore this is through tax. And I am wondering what, in order for that to happen, you would need to start measuring polarization, right? And so what do you think needs to happen?
I mean, I think the main thing that needs to happen is we need to find a way of measuring this polarization footprint, some kind of metric that is cross-platform and that captures this idea of the societal impact of the way algorithms are optimizing for engagement, essentially. And I just want to say that, you mentioned Section 230, but I think there's also a very big debate, which I'm very supportive of and part of as well, about how you could design social media platforms or algorithmically driven platforms differently. Algorithms could optimize for something else that was an engagement that might be less polluting and produce less polarization. That's an incredibly important debate. The question I have is, how do we incentivize companies to actually take that on? How do we incentivize companies to say, yes, I'm going to make those changes. I'm not going to use this simple engagement metric. I'm going to take on these design changes. And I think the way to do that is to essentially provide a financial disincentive to not doing it, which is why I'm so interested in this idea of a tax.
How you make it more expensive than that it starts to undermine the business model. Audience, we are about to start taking questions. I can see the first questions are coming in already. So perhaps let me get right to one here because it's to the point we just spoke about. So someone is asking, I love the idea of taxing. Will we run into problems with the strong protections of free speech, even if that speech can be categorized as misinformation, etc.? The listener is thinking of the example in the US where dark money donations are clearly bad for democracy and yet have ended up protected as political speech. So that's a very, for our global audience, a very US focused argument where, the protection of free speech basically is very, very, very wide ranging.
Yeah. I don't think that a polarization footprint necessarily needs to look at speech. It can look at metrics that have to do with the design of the platform. So it can look at, for example, things like the connection in between belonging to a group and only seeing certain types of content. So it doesn't need to get into issues of hate speech or free speech and the debate around censorship that comes with that. It can look simply at design choices around engagement. And that's very different, because we know that engagement is what is driving this kind of polarization. And as I said before, I actually don't think that content moderation is what's going to work particularly well to address polarization on platform.
There's one question to that Maria Ressa recently said at a conference. She used the metaphor of the river, whether you'd heard about that.
Yeah, so Maria Ressa said this was at the Internet of Trust conference. She said that, content moderation is like you take a glass of water out of a polluted river, and you clean that glass of water, and then you chuck it straight back in, right? And I was very taken by that metaphor, and I think that this idea of a polarization tax is essentially saying we need to build a water filtration plant. And also it's the social media platforms that need to build that water filtration plant. So let's create an incentive for that to happen.
Yeah, a new decision-making framework that would change the business model and price in the social responsibility or the negative social side effects, as you say. Here, other interesting question. One attendee is asking, I imagine you've thought deeply about why outrage as an emotional response is so strong and predictable. Why do we all get hooked? And how can we humans unlearn this individually and as a collective?
That's a huge question. And it's not actually something that I would say I'm an expert on. Now, there is actually quite a bit of research on why outrage is so engaging. So there's both kind of experimental research on it, and then there's social psychology research on why outrage is quite so engaging. It's not my area of expertise. What I can say is that we can see that playing out on social media platforms, and there's good evidence of the fact that moral outrage, content that produces moral outrage, leads to greater engagement, which is part of the core of this argument, which is essentially that because we're focusing on engagement metrics, we're getting more morally outrageous content that tends to be more polarizing. I think the psychological underpinnings of that is not something that I have personally researched very much.
I think it relates to a question I'm seeing here, and also says something in my own head right now. I think part of what we know, also you, Elena, knows, is that obviously there won't be a tax tomorrow, right? We have this idea now, so if this, it might never happen. But I think what is interesting about when I hear you speak, that, your mind starts to form an understanding of the polarization on social media being not a one-on-one image of what's happening in the world. So, do you think that when people look at this, have that in mind, they start to sort of, let's say, examine their own social media feed differently?
Maybe. It's possible. I think that, and perhaps that's what the previous question was pointing to, can we unlearn this desire to engage with morally outrageous content? I think that, there is some value in that kind of digital literacy, in sort of understanding that people might be setting out to outrage you, rather than trying to convey any kind of information about an opinion. I actually was talking to my mom recently about polarization, and I said to her, I now use a rule of thumb, and I think many people who have been engaging with this work use that rule of thumb, which is that if my reaction to a news headline or a social media post is, oh my God, then I probably need to look a little more carefully. There's probably a reason, a motivation for that headline to be that. And that motivation actually links to this whole idea of why we need a tax, because a lot of journalists report that they post outrageous headlines because otherwise they lose at the engagement game. There's actually some great research on celebrities who decided they wanted to stop being morally outrageous in what they were saying. And suddenly they start seeing their social media engagement dropping and dropping and dropping. And so they had to get back into the outrage game. So I think it would take a lot for that to be a cultural shift without the sort of the technical support of the redesign of platforms, because in the end, it's kind of a socio-technical issue, right? It can't just be a societal issue; it's also a technical issue.
Here's a question: how to build up work with major social media platforms to transform the way they operate?
Well, we do work with Facebook specifically. So we're a trusted partner of Facebook in Kenya specifically, and we've spoken quite a lot to their trusted partner program. I think there is some openness to these conversations from within platforms. That's our biggest engagement. We also kind of engage in forums where platforms come together with civil society to discuss these issues. I was at a technology and social cohesion conference in San Francisco recently about that. So I think there's some collaborative work that can be done, and then some sort of pressure work that can be done, which is more where this idea of a polarization tax sits.
Yeah, because you said there's no financial incentive for social media platforms to voluntarily change their model. Here's someone saying, I love the idea of a polarization tax, and also that you mentioned possible new designs of platform incentive models. Do you know of any examples of such new designs or projects experimenting with that?
Yeah, there are lots. I just wrote a different paper on the algorithmic management of conflict on social media, where we talk about a bunch of those together with Jonathan Stray and Ravi, where we talk about a bunch of those examples. So I can point you to that later. But just to give one, there's a piece of work around bridge-based ranking, which I find really interesting, that I believe has come out of Harvard, where basically what they're looking at is could we have algorithms maximize not for engagement in general, so how much engagement there is, but for pieces of content that have engagement from two sides of a divide. So we would uprank content that essentially has engagement across a divide, and this would mean that we'd get a very different kind of ranking of content that would be less polarizing. And this bridge-based ranking was then used, I believe, by Twitter's Birdwatch, if you're familiar with that piece of work. So I can send some more links. I don't want to continue on that, but there is a lot of work going on in that space.
Thank you. And just for the for those who ask the question, their follow-up questions, we'll aim to sort of consolidate the links and then send out with an email in a couple of days. We are almost at time, but I want to make time for two or three more questions here. Someone is asking, do you have any research that is focused on US communities, and is there any difference in how US audiences engage with disinformation? I haven't done that research, but there is a really great group called More in Common that has done research on how US communities engage with polarization, including with misinformation. Which I would encourage you to look at. There's actually, I would say that on the US is probably the country which there is the most research in this area. And then there's an interesting question. In addition to a polarization tax, is there an idea for a negative mental health tax, particularly for young people, but also adults?
Yeah, this is something that we've spoken about, right, Constanza? So something similar to kind of a soda tax, right? So there's a soda tax, and the idea of the soda tax is that because it's got so much sugar and all the health impacts, that it should be taxed differently. So yes, one could think about it in that way, because that is also another type of negative externality. I guess I've thought about it much more in the space of polarization, because that's what I know best. There is a whole body of research on the impacts of social media on mental health that could be used to make a very similar case. So I do think there's a link to be made there.
Yeah, and some interesting experiments also around tweaking the algorithm towards, sort of upping the benchmark on what is helpful, what is unhealthy for young children, for young adults especially. And we're at time, but I have one last question for you, Elena. So the carbon footprint, someone reminds us correctly, so was really meant for individual consumers to start monitoring their own behavior and to basically let go, sort of give a pass to corporations, to shift the burden towards the individual consumer. that is not what you're intending here, right? So I give you the window of opportunity now to talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the carbon footprint has been used in that way. I think the carbon footprint has also been used to look at the impact of a company or a production site on the production of carbon and therefore on pollution and climate change. So I want to be very clear that I'm not thinking of it as an individual carbon footprint, but rather as the carbon footprint of the main producer in this environment, which in this case I think would be the social media companies. But I'd love to have 10 more minutes to think about and to unpick the differences here and how we'd have to be very clear about that distinction. So I appreciate somebody pointing that out.
Thank you so much, Elena, for this rich and dense conversation. We managed quite well, I thought, going through it all. Thank you to the audience for asking these, really smart and intelligent and pointed questions that will help us refine the argument further. And I'm wishing everyone a good rest of the day. And we'll be back with Welcome Change next week. And you will all be getting a follow-up email from us with more thoughts from Elena. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Constanza.
And yes, the recording will be sent, trying to answer the last question.